Welcome to my monthly movies, where I review all the movies I watched monthly. So January and February were mostly full of Oscar catch-ups, so I was glad to finally see something new. March was an interesting month with a couple notable films that have certainly got the internet all riled up, but that's same old, same old. Firstly, I watched Parallel Mothers, No Time to Die, and Writing with Fire. I covered all of these in my Oscar review, so go check that out if you want my thoughts. Okay, so I was gonna go through this video chronologically in terms of what I watched, but I need to talk about Morbius. So, the Venom films have at least had Tom Hardy and Woody Harrelson acting completely absurd to keep them somewhat entertaining. It's like Sony wanted to recreate the campiness of Venom, so they hired Jared Leto, but in an unfortunate turn of events, this is the one performance where he decided to act completely normal throughout the whole thing. There's not even the slightest bit of Joker or Paolo Gucci here. Morbius is the worst thing a bad film can be. It's just really boring. It's the longest 90-minute movie I have ever sat through. The guy next to me in the movie theater had brought his young nephew or something with him, and the kid was loudly asking questions about, basic plot things, and the guy was just repeating the character's dialogue verbatim in order to explain it. Now, as weird as that scenario was, it's the type of thing that would normally really bother me, especially because he was checking his phone every 10 minutes, but honestly, I can't really fault him for that. But I was just so disinterested in the whole experience that I didn't even mind that the epitome of everything I hate about movie theaters was sitting directly to my left. Now, that's not to say, however, that this film isn't full of stupid shit, so here's a collection of some of the odd moments and lines of dialogue from this film. Morbius opens with Dr. Michael Morbius investigating a cave of vampire bats in South America. He then says to his colleague, "This is a vampire bat. It is capable of eating any other animal up to 10 times its own body weight." The film then cuts to a picked clean skeleton of a large mammal about the size of a capybara. We then get a flashback of Morbius and his best friend Lucian living in Greece for some reason at a hospital as children, both affected by the same blood disease. Morbius is American and Lucian is British. When Dr. Nichols introduces Morbius to Lucian, Morbius chooses to nickname Lucian Milo, the name of the child who died previously in the bed given to Lucian. Lucian is now called Milo by all of his friends and family for the rest of the film. After this encounter, we see out the window that this highly specialized blood hospital is across the street from a middle school. Every day when the students get out of class, they crowd around Morbius and Milo's window to shout "freak" at them over and over. All of these children are also British. Later, Milo leaves the hospital when he's not supposed to, requiring crutches to walk and appearing incredibly weak. He is then assaulted by 3 of the students. Milo throws his crutch into the neck of one of the kids, immediately incapacitating him. He is then brutally beaten by the other 2 11-year-olds. One day at the hospital, Milo's blood transfusion machine stops working, and he immediately faints. Morbius is able to repair the machine in about 10 seconds with the spring of a ballpoint pen. This act earns him a full ride to one of the most prestigious schools for the gifted in New York. There, he is able to complete medical school by the age of 19. When Morbius is preparing to give himself vampire DNA, he claims this will cure his blood disorder because bats have an enzyme that acts as an anticoagulant. This implies that his disease is some sort of clotting issue. In the universe of Morbius, blood thinners apparently do not exist. After injecting himself with the vampire bat DNA, Morbius then enters a chamber of bats in his lab, and they play the Batman Begins theme. He then states, "The vampire bats would eat any other human, but not me. I've become something different. Now, they treat me like one of the pack." During the cops' investigation into Morbius's kills, one officer notices a litter box in his empty apartment. He bends down and shakes the litter box. He is surprised when a cat is not summoned by this. In the middle of the film, Morbius is in need of a new lab. He then overhears 2 counterfeit money distributors talking about how they need to get back to their lab. Morbius tracks them down and scares off everyone involved in the operation. Somehow, this counterfeit money lab has the same equipment as a genetic research facility. When devising a plan to undo the vampire curse, Morbius states, "This is a DNA-based poison. It's deadly to bats, but fatal to humans." Deadly to bats, but fatal to humans. During the final battle between Morbius and Milo, Morbius lands the final blow by summoning a Kamehameha made of bats. Not energy shaped like bats. Real, normal vampire bats. This kills Milo, despite him also being a vampire. Despite all of these moments, Morbius does not manage to be entertaining. It gets a 2 out of 10. Watch it at your own risk. So, the first non-Oscar movie I watched this month was Claire Denis' Let the Sunshine In, and I did not like it. I just finished reading Roland Barthes' A Lover's Discourse for class, and a film adaptation of an entirely non-narrative work certainly intrigued me, but I don't think it quite worked. Let the Sunshine In tries far too hard to juggle too many ideas. I appreciated certain scenes in which the substance of conversation is lifted essentially directly from Barthes, but it tries way too hard to have it both ways, in that it presents the scenes as sort of vignettes strung together into a sort of narrative. All the while, it attempts to contextualize a lover's discourse in a story that comments on the partnerless middle-aged, but it doesn't have enough time to fully explore this idea. It's being pulled in too many different directions, and even though I didn't enjoy its 90 minutes, I think another half hour would have done a lot to engage with everything it clearly wants to. 4 out of 10. Next, I saw My Cousin Vinny, and it was pretty good. It's a classic, and I'm once again surprised how long it took me to get around to it. I enjoyed it, but not without a few little nitpicks. The movie doesn't have as many jokes as it should outside of just swearing. Weirdly enough, if you got rid of the F-bombs, this could probably be rated PG. The cross-examination sequences are great, but honestly it just made me want to watch 12 Angry Men again. It's good, and I'm giving it a 7 out of 10, but it does a lot of stuff that I've seen done better elsewhere. Next, I saw The Batman, and I have many thoughts. Superhero properties have been going the way of taking on other genres as a means of evolving. Logan, Joker, and WandaVision all take strong influence from their inspirations, but The Batman isn't just influenced. This is a detective noir thriller that happens to have Batman in it. Here, Batman is a detective first, vigilante second. While it was obvious from the trailers that they were going for the self-destructive route, I was particularly surprised it didn't focus on the no-kill rule as part of it. It's mostly grounded in him trying to push himself above what he can physically do. You feel how exhausted and in pain he is. Reeves also brings us a version of Gotham that feels more in line with the Arkham video games more than any other version. While Burton's has a socialite flair, Schumacher's is an acid trip, and Nolan's is just, well, Chicago, this feels like a gloomy, thug-ridden cesspool of a city that's begging to be put out of its misery. I'm tempted to compare it to Phillips' version from Joker, but even that had more of a glossiness to it. Locations also feel very isolated here. Much of the film is structured as a crime scene, chat at the back signal, return to mob club, repeat. However, the film isn't without bumps along the way. It loses its momentum at a few points, and it feels like it's repeating beats when the narrative digresses from the core investigation. On a second viewing, though, the pacing felt like less of an issue. Although there is a very clear shift from Riddler stuff to Falcone stuff, but the film does a solid job of grounding this sort of side quest in the context of Riddler's larger plan. It also loses me in the third act a bit. It slightly feels like it comes out of nowhere, and it could have been fixed with just a single throwaway line earlier in the film. I felt that this was more prominent the second time I watched, and spoilers from here on out, so go to this time if you want to skip the rest of this review. The Riddler's plan superficially makes sense. Flooding the city in a biblical cleansing of the unredeemable is a sound motivation for a villain, and the physicality of it justifies it. Just as Gotham is broken at the core of its soul, it is also broken at the core of its physical foundation, built on unstable ground that can be swept away if the seawall is compromised. However, the flood obviously hurts the poorest the most, and this seems antithetical to the Riddler's extreme form of populism, I guess you could call it. It mostly lands, and it's not without its faults, but I'm glad to see this side of Batman brought to life on the big screen. 8 out of 10. Then I watched Fresh, which doesn't reinvent the wheel when it comes to captive horror thrillers, but a charming, goofy, and sadistic Sebastian Stan keeps this movie really entertaining. It has really great pacing with a witty and commentary-heavy first act that feels incredibly light and quick. It left a few things unresolved by the end, and it sets up a few too many plot points that just kind of disappear, but its sharp dialogue throughout and payoff once the inevitable breakout sequence gets going left me moderately satisfied. 6 out of 10. Next, I watched the entire Jackass franchise. I forgot how much of a soft spot I have for this series, and I'm grouping these ones together because they represent a consistent level of quality that they've come to be known for. While the first film feels like an awkward attempt at adapting the TV show's format to film, everything that follows is what makes this series memorable. There isn't a massive gap in quality across these films, although I will say that 2.5 feels more cohesive in its vision than 3.5. These ones are supposed to be documentary-style outtakes of bits that didn't work in the preceding film, but 3.5 kind of just feels like a regular Jackass movie. This series is schadenfreude in its purest form, and while this is definitely not a series that I needed to catch up on in order to enjoy the newest one, I'm really glad I did. The score ranges from probably somewhere in the 6 to 7 out of 10 area, while the first film gets a 4 out of 10. Completing my Daniel Craig era Bond rewatch in the lead up to No Time to Die, I watched Spectre, which I think gets way too much hate. The film certainly suffers from a contrived plot and a billion gaps in logic, but it isn't trying to be as much of a serious character study as Skyfall, so I'm far more forgiving of its shortcomings. It definitely draws on previous eras for inspiration rather than its direct predecessors, and considering the story it's trying to tell, I think that works to its benefit. I wrote an incredibly in-depth review of it on my Letterboxd, so for my full thoughts, go check that out, but here I'm gonna give it a 7 out of 10. Jackass 3D tries to give this series a send-off to mixed results, so I'm glad that Jackass Forever came along to totally blow it out of the water. This is the most painful, disgusting, and extreme of the entire series, and it was so great to see most of the cast reunited. The newcomers also felt like they actually belonged. If this was where the series ends, then this is the highest note imaginable. I'm eagerly awaiting 4.5. 8 out of 10. And in the total opposite direction of Jackass, I watched A Bug's Life. It's one of the few Pixar movies that have escaped me, and I'm glad I finally got around to it. What I found myself enjoying the most was that, like many of their best regarded films, it isn't beholden to an issue that many of the recent Pixar movies are plagued by. It's not trying too hard to be a Pixar movie. It tackles heavy themes, but it does so without constructing its entire world in a way that begs for those themes. It's a charming and cute way to teach about accepting others' differences and learning to see them as strengths, not being limited in ability by one's perceived characteristics, and finding creative solutions to seemingly impossible challenges. I'm glad I finally saw this, and I hope its age doesn't prevent younger kids from watching it today. 7 out of 10. Then I watched Jujutsu Kaisen 0, which is the better of 2 animated movies released this month with a panda in it. As someone who was entirely unfamiliar with the series before watching this, I was thoroughly impressed. The biggest selling point of this film is that it feels appropriately self-contained, despite having every opportunity to veer into prequel cliché land and inject fan service. The film is able to smartly avoid the pacing issues that commonly plague film adaptations of manga, delivering its story succinctly within 1 hour 45 minutes, and using every moment of it to drive the narrative forward, while also incorporating substantive characterization. The film is also able to establish its lore really effectively. I was also so glad that the ending wasn't an obvious lead-in for the series, delivering an actually satisfying conclusion that, while light on theme, wraps up the narrative cleanly while also respecting the world's established rules. While a post-credit scene alludes to an aspect of the series that fans will certainly pick up on, it didn't come off as out of place to the casual viewer. I was far more impressed than I ever thought I was going to be, and I'm giving it an 8 out of 10. Then I watched the other animated panda movie this month, Turning Red. This is by no means a bad film, but it's trying to tackle a lot of topics with pretty messy execution. Firstly, I'll say that I really appreciated how lively the film feels, and Mei is a fantastic Pixar protagonist. She's the type of high-energy comedy character that often annoys me, but like last year's The Mitchells vs. the Machines, the scenarios are so well written and the characters are so clearly defined that even when I didn't relate to a specific scenario, I empathized deeply and was genuinely invested in her aspirations. There are 2 central thematic topics going on here. There's the puberty allegory and the commentary on generational behavior. However, these are often kind of in conflict with each other. The way Mei's mother acts is supposed to be excused by the way she grew up, but it isn't really justified, and the way she deals with her adolescence feels totally opposed to what Mei is going through. The ending also kind of asserts that you can pick and choose how much you embrace that part of yourself, which is also counterintuitive to Mei's journey of self-acceptance. I enjoyed Turning Red, but I think it needed one further draft to unlock its full potential. 6 out of 10. Next, I kept with the animation theme and watched The Jungle Book after being told that having only seen the remake was unacceptable. It's definitely not my favorite of the classic Disney animated films, but it certainly has the same charm as many of the others, albeit in a more serviceable manner. It's generally well paced, but I think a couple of the elements, namely Mowgli as a character, feel incredibly underdeveloped. He falls into the trap of being the nominal protagonist, but ultimately a vehicle to introduce more interesting and entertaining side characters. Shere Khan also isn't that great of an antagonistic presence either. We're only told that we should care about his threat for most of the film, and when he shows up, we don't see the danger he presents until the final confrontation. The songs here are also very hit or miss. There's a reason Bare Necessities and I Wanna Be Like You are the only ones people are able to name. The Jungle Book does a lot that other Disney films of its era do a lot better. It gets a 5 out of 10, and I'm gonna be totally honest, I like the remake a lot more. I think it fixes a ton of the film's issues. Next, I watched From Dusk Till Dawn, and this is one of the few Tarantino projects that I've never gotten around to, and I'm not mad that I waited. There are essentially two films here. The first half is a classic Tarantino crime drama that's honestly being stifled by Robert Rodriguez's direction. The two filmmaker styles are very much clashing throughout this movie. Rodriguez's self-indulgence often ruins the tension of some fantastically written scenes. Information is revealed too quickly, the camera behaves in ways that run contrary to the tone of the scene, and I found myself really frustrated with the execution. Then the film takes a drastically campy turn, and as enjoyable as it is conceptually, I was really disappointed that it throws a lot of its character conflicts out the window. The direction takes an even further dive. There's no sense of space, the vampires don't feel like a threat when in a horde, they just kind of stand idly by as they get killed one by one. There are some aspects to enjoy here that make the experience overall decent, namely in the first half, but I can't give it any higher than a 5 out of 10. Then I watched the 2019 Little Women, and I'm apparently in the minority of not absolutely adoring this film, but there are certainly many aspects I enjoyed. Greta Gerwig directs her films with such dynamism and is able to make her actors commit so wholeheartedly to the material. Everyone here, within the core cast at least, is on their A-game. This is a really hard novel to adapt, given its length and reliance on mundane domesticities to develop its characterizations and relationships. My main issue with this adaptation is that it seems mostly interested in taking the moments from the novel that move the plot forward, and omitting the ones that don't carry as much narrative weight. It's a sensible choice. Of course you want your film to maintain a sense of agency, and it's a really well-paced film. However, I feel that many of the climactic scenes ring hollow because it's lacking some of those other, less plot-heavy and more character-based moments from the book. I also thought the framing device of cross-cutting timelines, while novel, leaves the story less accessible to those unfamiliar with the source material. Although it revealed new parallels to me between parts 1 and 2 of the novel, I had trouble keeping tabs on where we were at times, and I read the book last week. It feels like one of those films that could benefit from a fan re-edit. There's an incredible version of this here that's held back by some bold but not entirely successful adapted choices, and I'm giving it a 6 out of 10. And that about wraps up everything I watched this month. I've already seen a few new April releases and some classics, so make sure to subscribe so you don't miss those when my April video comes out, and until then, go check out 2023 Best Picture frontrunner Morbius.